Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Carl Thomas Gladstone, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Uproar Live. Today, we have the pleasure to speak with some of our favorite partners in Holy Mischief, our friends from G's Magazine, and they've brought a couple of conversation partners with them to talk about some aspects of the most recent issue of G's Magazine on disobedience. And we can't thank you enough for being here. And I'll throw it to you all to make some introductions.
Thank you, Carl. It's always great to be here with you. For those who are listening and have not heard about G's, I'll say a little bit about who we are. G's Magazine is a quarterly, nonprofit, ad-free print magazine at the intersection of social justice, art, and activism for people on the fringes of faith in both Canada and the U.S. It's a place for contemplative cultural resistance. We hope that at best we offer a prophetic and provocative voice to the institutional church and a pastoral presence to those laboring on the front lines of social change. My name is Lydia Wiley-Kellerman, and I'm the editor of G's. And we're particularly focusing today on our spring issue, which was focused on disobedience, on questions around breaking the law, on the long tradition of civil disobedience, and aim to explore the ways that we bring our whole bodies to the work for justice and what it means to put our bodies in places of risk. And we also explored how this particular historical moment demands action and risk and imagination from all of us. We're also mindful that this came out just as COVID-19 was hitting, and in a lot of ways, our historical moment has changed pretty dramatically. And we'll talk about that more as we go into this time together. But we're really grateful to have featured writings from both Bill Wiley-Kellerman and Will C, and to be able to talk with them today.
Thanks, Lydia. So I'm Kateri. I'm the Associate Editor and Circulation Manager for G's, and really excited to give a little introduction to our two guests this morning. Bill Wiley-Kellerman is a nonviolent community activist, retired pastor, and author living in Detroit. And he's also the dad of two of our G's staff members, Lydia and Lucy. Will C is a Detroit cultural organizer. He's a divorced father, an Orisha priest of Sango, and a grassroots organizer with a passion for bringing the liberation lessons of Detroit to global audiences. And both Will and Bill have been our mentors and comrades, community members, and thought partners for many years now. And since working with G's, they've also been regular co-conspirators in this work. So thanks both for being here. And I'm wondering, we'll start with Bill. If you could just tell us a little bit more about who you are and the work you're doing, and then we'll pass it over to Will.
Yeah, I'm so grateful to be on with Will C. I have been involved in a number of projects and movement spaces over a period of time, and I'm so glad that he's kind of becoming a regular writer for G's. Yeah, my work these days, having retired, still focuses, as it did when I was actively pastoring a congregation, still focuses on nonviolence and community movement work in Detroit. I think of myself as having a place-based vocation to the city of Detroit, a kind of rooted calling to the city. And people in the movement circles that I'm part of generally still call me Pastor Bill, and so my work, even in those circles, often includes pastoral care or ceremonial or prayer, public theology work. Specifically, stuff I'm doing these days is connected to the Poor People's Campaign, Michigan Poor People's Campaign, which is part of a national movement, and the water struggle in Detroit. I've taught theology and ministry over the years, and seminary, college, and congregation level, and I'm doing less of that now, but still writing. Usually my writing is in relation to a specific moment or issue in the service of church or movement, though sometimes those shorter things get gathered into books. So that continues to be my work these days.
Thanks, Bill. And Will, we'd love to hear from you.
Good to see everybody again. It's been a little while. Good to be talking with you too, Bill. Our relationship and our working relationship has developed over the course of years and is evolving, and now this new wrinkle of G's Magazine, has come in the last couple of years. I enjoy writing for G's Magazine and really resonate with the mission of what you may call contemplation, or others may call spirituality and social justice. I'm also a hip hop artist under the name Will C, Willssee, and even in that, working under the notice of entertainment justice, looking at making pop culture that is not preachy per se, but that gives the energy that we need in this day, the energy, the truth telling. So I try to do that lyrically in addition to my writing. I've been a long time environmental justice organizer in Detroit, and also connecting Detroit with movements around the country and around the world. And I too have quote unquote retired from that particular phase. But I realize now that my organizing and my activism has shifted. Definitely involved in New African Independence projects and projects looking at linking and strengthening the African diaspora towards communalism and socialism. Definitely, I have had a chronic kidney condition for many, many years, most of my life, and have gotten more and more active in the disability justice movement, particularly in supporting people with disabilities and chronic illnesses and caregivers. Shout out to Detroit Disability Power. And that actually comes out of environmental justice, looking at how these environmental conditions are creating these health conditions in our communities. Or as Baba Baxter says, this society is disabling us. And this goal of supporting people, Bill calls it pastoral care. I think I call it right now spiritual development. I'm a newly initiated Orisha priest of Shango, the divinity of thunder, the divinity of the drum. So I'm very excited in my work, revitalizing traditional African culture, traditional African religion within the diaspora. And lastly, I'm working on this project, which I'll probably talk a little bit more later. So happy that Kateri is going to be a presenter in it, among others that we know and love, called Wilds Beyond Climate Justice, which kind of, like many things that we're talking about, look at how can we go beyond mainstream analysis of what the problem is and what the solutions are, and maybe take a pause and come to a new conclusion, even a new conclusion on what the problems are. And that will give us a space, which I think is what we're going to talk about today. That'll give us a space to make new actions, and to make new actions that maybe we never could have even foreseen. And so I guess I'm still staying busy in my retirement too, Bill.
You are busy.
Thanks to you both. So grateful for who both of you are and all the work that you're doing. I want to spend a little bit of time having each of you reflect very briefly about what it is that you wrote about in this issue. And I'll say for folks who are listening, You can actually find both of their writings on our website. And I'll just say that G's is very committed to being a print magazine. We think that there's something that is different when you hold something in your hands versus when you read it on the screen. And we're constantly looking for ways to tangibly engage with the word and with art and with one another. So we only pick a few articles each issue to highlight on our website, but we happen to have both of these powerful pieces there. So you're welcome to find them there if you don't have a copy of the magazine, or of course you can get a copy of the magazine. But if each of you would just say briefly what you both wrote about for this issue.
Go ahead, Will.
All right, for sure. The title of my piece was Breaking America's Law. And it begins with a story told by Detroit historian who also is a virus survivor. And he wrote this is a tangent, he wrote a dope and powerful first-person experience of his symptoms and his recovery, which was very helpful and very inspirational. It was, I think he wrote it when he was about 18 days in, and he kind of was almost on the upswing. But his name is Baba Jamon Jordan, and he's a Detroit Jim. He does tours of Detroit, historical tours, and greatly contributes to our historical understanding. And he talks about how the Detroit Police Department was found. And it was actually founded when two Africans were running away from slavery, and they were caught and placed in this jail. And the Detroit African Black community came out in such numbers that they were able to free them and sprit them away to Windsor across the river. And the powers that be, the powers of slavery, the powers of whiteness and business and all these things that intersect, said that they will never be overwhelmed and never be outnumbered again. And from that, they instituted curfews, and from that, they instituted the patrol force that would become the Detroit Police Department. And I think about the talk, quote unquote, if you've heard of that phrase, that Black families have with their children. And this talk is about police. And many times it seems that this talk is filled with fear. And I have a particular twist on this talk, which I say that we are in an ongoing war. It is unproductive to fear the enemy, but also unwise to force unnecessary confrontation or to prematurely broadcast one's intentions. And both of my parents were born in the South. Both of them are of an age in which they were at least in adolescence, if not adulthood, before this thing called segregation ended. So they had a number of years, and by the time even the idea of equality or the idea of whatever, they had lived whatever, 16, 18, 20, 22, however many years, 25. They had lived some years under apartheid, under Jim Crow. And growing up, I was always aware, and it was a real intellectual challenge for me during adolescence, that there was a war against my people. And what is my relationship to that war? And in this work that we're doing with Wild Beyond Climate Justice, we've been discussing and talking about this phrase that means a lot to me, which is the phrase of spiritual warrior. And I really identify with that phrase. I really identify with that mission. In Orisha culture, a lot of the Orisha, almost all of the Orishas are warriors. And so I'm wrestling and defining for myself what being a spiritual warrior is. But part of being a spiritual warrior is a hesitancy to put yourself in the enemy's hands. And so this, a lot of what I talk about in the piece is my relationship to going to jail, my relationship to being captured is an objective that this society has and has successfully done for millions of my people. And so it's this notion of doing it voluntarily if I'm going to go to jail, they're going to have to catch me, and it's going to be for something that I did that I did not want to be caught for. And that's my position right now, but I'm always open to hear others' stories, hear others' paths, and hear how other spiritual warriors are relating to this moment. So thank you for letting me share a little bit about my piece on breaking America's law.
Yeah, my article actually was titled by the editorial staff, Eucharist at Gunpoint, and it concerns what I call a liturgical direct action that I was part of in the early 1980s, where a group of us did the Easter Vigil Liturgy, which is a specific service of worship in relation to Easter, walking on to the SAC base at Wurtsmith Air Force Base, walking down the runway, and over a period of hours, getting all the way to the high security area, the area that's designated for what do they call it? I was going to say deadly force is authorized, and we completed the Eucharist there at Gunpoint. The high security area was where B-52s, which could be argued had been a deterrent weapon, mutual assured destruction weapon, were being armed with cruise missiles, and basically at that point being turned into first strike nuclear weapons. And our action was part of many such actions that were going on around the country, around this country, and around the world for that matter. The anti-military, anti-nuclear movement was very, very lively at that point, and there were, as I say, many such actions. It was important to me, partly because of where we'd done actions connected with the Christian liturgical year around Good Friday or Lent, Advent, penitential seasons, or the Feast of the Holy Innocents, the darker, bloodier days of the church year. This was the first time for me, and actually I think for many people, where we kind of claimed the high holy days of Easter and the politics of that, the freedom from the power of death and bondage to death, and the logic of necessity that goes with these weapons. So it was important to me in that aspect. What I write about is actually the process of discerning the action, which took over the course of a year, a whole series of retreats and Bible study and life sharing, confessing our fears. For example, often is not in such process when you go around and confess the things you're afraid of. Often is not they're the very things you're actually being called to. And kept inside, fears can rule you and hold you back. Shared within the context of community, they can be not only freeing and freed from, but actually in the service of the Holy Spirit instead of in the service of the powers. So the article is really about that discernment process. It's not altogether pretty, because I make a confession of a point where my own ego got involved, and I think I sadly blocked the process. But again, I think that ends up being an important lesson for myself and perhaps for others as well. think of it in relation to Will's article, and you know, when all these trucks came rushing out and military personnel jumped out and pointed assault weapons at us, they held fire and waited. I think if we'd have been a circle of Black folks, African Americans, the weapons might have gone off, and we see that all the time. So that's a, you know, reading Will's article and the questions he's raising there about basically about the illegality of Black bodies, sort of puts our action not so much in the question in the perspective of white privilege, though that might well be said, but in a yeah, it puts it in a contrast. So I appreciate putting these two things together.
Thank you both. Yeah, we do too. And we're so aware that it felt ironic sending out this issue, which we'd already put together, put to print before coronavirus was even on our radar. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of quarantine, folks are receiving this issue on civil disobedience. And it's just all of us talking about joining together and putting our bodies in the line. And now we're being told not to gather and sheltering in place. So we're wondering how each of you think about resistance and movement in this particular moment of quarantine and sheltering.
You want me to start off?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. When I see the word ironic, or when I hear the word ironic, I just have to mention the irony that there are people out there that are using images of civil rights and language of civil rights to advance what I would call their right to be served. You know, their right to get their nails done, their right to be waited upon, their right to buy all the things that make them feel good. And in many ways, putting themselves and other people at risk. But the language, if you look at the language they're using, that I've seen them use I've seen them use pro-choice language. I've seen them use civil rights language. So it's very fascinating that our entire culture, our entire country, this United States empire is very aware of the movement and even is aspiring, even if they're doing it in, I don't know if we can cuss, so even if they were doing it in messed up ways, they're looking to this thing called movement somehow to guide them. So I think that's pretty ironic, as crazy as that may be. And I like what you said, Bill, about freedom from the power of death. And I'm gonna sit with that. But I like that in Orisha culture we talk about active relationships with our ancestors, and the ancestors are beings. We have many more relationships than just with the people that you see walking around in the 3 dimensions. Death is just a transition, you know. And Marcus Garvey, when he passed, he said, "Look for me in the whirlwind." And I want to write an article about climate justice and the ancestors and the weather these storms as being like the unresolved fury of our ancestors, many millions of which died in these oceans, you know what I'm saying, over hundreds of years. And so I think that as people are struggling over these questions of life and death, I hope that our activism expands, you know what I'm saying, to, you know, I hope the spiritual warriors step forward. And I mean, you've seen that a lot, like with the Native American led, you know, like the Keystone XL and the different pipelines that come out of the indigenous movements. Many people only see, you know, oh, this is about oil. but there's a lot when you get into it or near it, there's a lot of spiritual components, and it's really about holding space to develop a relationship with the earth. And so I think that many people are passing. So I hope that a new relationship with ancestry, a new relationship of what this movement is, can come about. And then lastly, I got to say this, through my work with disability justice, I just find it's a powerful moment in which the entire nation is afraid of getting sick. And I'm in disability justice circles, and some people are literally saying, I'm prepared for this. Some people are saying, I've been dealing with, I've been sheltering in place for the last 6 months already because of certain immunosuppressant conditions. Some people are saying, I already didn't leave my house, and leaving my house already was a calculation and a risk. And I think that the disability justice movement has a lot to offer at these times, in terms of how we navigate. And we are not, people with disabilities and chronic illnesses are not only people to receive care and only people to be saved and whatnot. But I think that this is an important moment to hear about this leadership in disability justice and healing justice. And I think it's going to have a lot to offer, because I think that I was reading this quote by Sins Invalid, which is a disability justice creative coalition on the West Coast. And they said that, disability is the largest minority in the world. And if you think of, elders as people get older, as you think of all the various chronic conditions, especially those that are exacerbated by this society, we all deal with it, even though it hasn't necessarily been politicized. And now more than ever, we're all dealing with it. And we just have to politicize. We just have to understand it and put it in the right context, and it'll be a powerful impetus for the movement.
All of that is so helpful. Yeah, thank you. I guess I think of several things, all practical and concrete in this recent period. One is that I think of nonviolent direct action as always being a politics of the body. It's where you put your body, whether that's forbidden space, whether you use your body to block something violent or unjust, whether you use your hands to turn on water to someone who's been shut off. It's always it's a body politics, where you stand, where you sit, where you walk, where you refuse to go, and spaces. So it so it has been interesting and difficult to think about how do you do direct action in a time when we're not only sheltering in place, but where so much of movement work and conversation has gone digital, such as this conversation here, where we're each in different places. For example, the Poor People's Campaign nationally, we're building for the largest digital march on Washington ever on June the 20th, and it's serious organizing, and it's being done in digital spaces. It's going to be, I think it'll be a very interesting event. There's cultural work being done, digitally as well, and it'll move toward what the big priority for this next period is: voter registration, resisting voter suppression, getting the vote out, presuming there's going to be an election. So yeah, it's changed. The campaign that started with direct action, 40 days of weekly civil disobedience actions, has gone into this digital phase. Then there's the question of obedience and disobedience. I think Will is right. The way the civil rights language and legacy has been employed by folks carrying assault weapons into the Capitol, or doing, as you say, haircut actions at the Capitol in violation of what are regulations for the safety of other people, and having contempt for that. And I've been thinking how much white supremacy, which is exemplified so openly and directly in those actions, and of which to which white people are all subject and all in bondage to, the extent to which it's a spiritual wound that makes you incapable of empathy or feeling other people's pain. A history of the taking of the land, indigenous genocide, chattel slavery. It means that white folks know at some level that death is underneath everything. So denial is the order of the day, and that turns into a spiritual incapacity that we're being not only evinced by the president, but by these actions. And then the other thing, we're trying to make a plan to do a vigil on the Capitol steps, and at safe distance. It would have a memorial dimension to it, and a rebuke of the white supremacy things that have happened there. And there's a concern that this is, we're supposed to stay at home and this is illegal. We would be breaking the law. And in fact, we want to be, in this moment, demonstrating a fidelity to honoring what Dr. King in the letter to the Birmingham jail was called upon to make a distinction between just and unjust laws. And this is the time for discerning that, right? So obedience, oddly, becomes part of the we are seeing all kinds of creative things that people are doing involving automobiles, for example, Cosecha and Rapid Response, Southwest Rapid Response, did a pretty remarkable automobile caravan action down at the Monroe Detention Center, calling on people to be released in their I think there are creative things that can be done. But it raises all sorts of ironic, as we say,
Well, thank you both for all of that. I think
Yeah.
they are things that we're wrestling with at G's and things that I feel are sort of deeply wrestling in myself. I think a lot about this digital technology conversation, especially for G's, where we're so committed to trying to keep sort of embodied work where we're not looking to create more spaces for people to be in front of a computer screen, but to be in community or be outside or to have things feel tangible. And yet also seeing right now the real tools that technology offers and the need for connection, but then also not wanting that to just be the automatic answer, that sort of all we do and all of our work is shifted onto screens. And I think the other sort of piece that I'm wrestling with, and I think you've both addressed it some, but maybe there's sort of more to say. I feel this tension and this wrestling between, on one hand, it feels like I think a lot about Grace Boggs's words of these are the times to grow our souls, like while we're sheltered in our homes, who are we going to be on the other side of this? How do we make sure that when we come out of our doors, we're not returning to normal, that we're not letting capitalism come back, that we're taking this time to love our kids and grow food. And, for those of us who are at home, how do we think about that space? And then on the other hand, it feels like the coronavirus is really uncovering so much, that so much is being exposed. And we can't be out in the streets in a massive way. There are people in Detroit who still don't have running water. There are people who can't pay rent. There's workers, labor issues, and there's all these laws that are being passed so quietly in the sort of guise of a pandemic. And so what does it mean that we can't be massively together? And so is there a way, is this a moment to think new and creatively about what activism looks like, what saying no means that is embodied and communal? I don't know, you've both addressed that, but if there's anything coming up, I'd love to think more on that.
I love the question, how you frame this entire conversation around risk. And I think I have to just say, on this day, on May 21st, we're entering a new phase. And what I mean by that is, yes, there is this stay-at-home, shelter-in-place aspect, but all over the country, all sorts of businesses are reopening, all sorts of cafeterias and restaurants and things. And so we're entering a new phase, and we've entered into a new phase. And I've been talking with friends, and this is the type of situation which, just as we do politically, everybody has to ascertain their own risk. I'm talking to folks, and folks is like, yo, I ain't going to none of these restaurants. I ain't going to none of these places. I don't care if the governor says it's open. You know what I'm saying? Like, each person, each family, each unit has to ascertain what those risks are and how they want to place their bodies, which is the exact same thing you're talking about. And is, sitting in this restaurant and doing this, is that a risk or is that not a risk? Just because now the governor or whoever says you can do it, does that mean you should do it? And so I think everybody has to ascertain risk in this day and age. And it's good for us to communally talk about that. It's good for us to share articles and share information and share, even what we're doing and how we make decisions. I ain't, what I'm saying? Like, I'm like, yo, I ain't changing my behavior to at least 3 weeks. You know what I'm saying? After these orders come out, because I just want to see how it unfolds, for a period of time. Whereas some people, the first day everything opens, they're walking around, taking their mask off, having a cocktail party, And so I think it's good for us politically, but just in this new phase where it's not all or nothing anymore, you know? And the other thing I would say, you're emphasizing communalism and things like that, but from a perspective of war, just a little bit that I've studied about guerrilla warfare, there's a lot that can be done with small groups of people. And guerrilla warfare has a different objective, but it's still breaking the law in a certain way. But its objective is to diminish the enemy's capacity. Its directive is not to bring people together, to feel together. Its directive is not to be a symbolic show. Very often it's done quietly, secretly, but it's, you know, if we could diminish, you know, shut down a bank's computer system, or, you know, talk about what capacities could we diminish, then there could be small groups of people that could continue to take action, and those actions could diminish the capacities of these systems that oppress. You know, like, what if we had hackers and they could just restore everybody's balance to zero, or restore thousands of people's balance to zero, you know, and we don't have to take credit for it. We don't have to say we did it, you know, which is a different framework than we're going to be out in the street. Everybody's going to see us, and we're going to get our politics from feeling together. But it's like, yo, what, you know what I'm saying? There's a lot that can be done, and you don't got to tell nobody you're doing it, you know? One of the phrases, real G's move in silence, you know? And so I think that there's new ways in which our action can cause different effects in the world. And, you know, you might not even tell your family members that you're doing it. You know what I'm saying? But it can help people. You see that with people turning people's water back on. You know what I'm saying? Like, people passing out the water keys, turning the water back on. You know what I'm saying? Like, we don't got to tell everybody, hey, I did this house and I did that house and I did this, you know? And so there's a lot of ways in which we can work. And just related to that also, I have to give a shout out, because we haven't talked about it explicitly, to mutual aid. I think that mutual aid is the shit. I think we should really uplift mutual. When you talk about, like, what do we do when we leave, and what do we, like, I think we should take these mutual aid infrastructures and bring that into our day-to-day life, bring that into our society, bring the phone trees, bring the checking in on people, bringing the taking elders, bringing them their medicine and stuff like that. Like, the mutual aid that's been developing, we should view that, like, we're not going to stop just because they told us that the vaccine is ready. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think we should view that as a cornerstone of what we're going to take and move forward. And we should even see that as the infrastructure that we need to move forward.
So good. So right. Growing our own souls, maybe starting there. In the almost immediately in the days of my own quarantining, I found myself really taking on a discipline and a commitment to be interceding, lighting a candle, burning sage, and interceding every day. I just felt like that was my work for people who I knew had cases or were hospitalized, for people by name, but also more broadly. And, you know, many people have made the comparison of shelter in place to Sabbath in the biblical tradition of sitting still, having a limit on how far you walk, or doing no work, and the sort of the spirituality of that. Within the biblical tradition, there's even a bigger picture of that every seventh year, the sabbatical year, debts were forgiven, slaves were freed, the land lay flat fallow, so that the poor and the creatures could eat. I mean, and the Jubilee year, even cases, elements beyond that. So we've sort of been led into an enforced Jubilee Sabbath, from which we have each of that institutionalized cycle biblically offered the community a lesson to be remembered, that to come back to break up the consolidation of land and capital. And so that to me seems like the huge opportunity of this time. It's also apocalyptic. That's that word, again, biblically means to pull the veil back, to a deeper reality is exposed. And those are the very things that, the kind of things that Lydia was naming at the beginning, the structures of race and poverty, where both the number of cases and the number of deaths from the virus are widely disproportionate in Black and brown communities, and that's a consequence of the way society, the city, policy, institutions are structured and put together. That's being exposed by this, and the notion of not going back to normal is a high priority, and that would be one example. One that I'm thinking immediately, practically about and working on is the water issue. Back in February, the water struggle in Detroit had been pushing the governor to call an end to water shutoffs, to put pressure on the mayor and the city of Detroit and other cities around the state to use her emergency powers to do that. And she determined in February that it didn't, the health crisis didn't rise to the level of an emergency. But then the virus happened, and she did employ her emergency powers to stop the shutoffs, and in fact to force the city to turn on some water. Not everybody. I mean, they've been continued to be deceptive about how many have been turned on and how many people remain without water. But so now we're coming. Next week she's going to be making an announcement, probably to continue the ban on shutoffs for the next period. And we're working to say this is the point to put an end to shutoffs altogether, to make that to make water affordability. This is we've seen what happens. We've seen how it creates a public health crisis for the city of Detroit, how it's a factor in being a hotspot and disproportionate deaths. This needs to be a permanent part of how we come out of this. So what's gotten exposed sets an agenda. I couldn't agree more about mutual aid and the way that's been just generated in all kinds of creative ways, and I don't think that's going to disappear. I think we're learning and deepening that vision of community at the base that's going to continue. And Will, your thoughts about risk, I so appreciate. And it's both a matter of risking, what are we risking or not risking about ourselves? And I'm one of those who has, to be honest, 6 of the 7 vulnerabilities to the virus. So I've tried to be careful and gotten a lot of encouragement from my family to be very careful. But the flip side of that is, what risks are we putting other people at? That's the so you shelter in place, or you wear a mask. The mask doesn't protect you; it protects other people, right? So how we minimize the risks that we create for others is part of how our thinking is being changed.
I was on Instagram and saw this post this morning from the marvelous Mrs. Basil, and it says, "You know why America can't flatten the curve? Because for too long, the quote majority have never had to listen to the word no. They've never had to operate within unsaid social rules. So the idea of restricting themselves to save themselves sounds like oppression." And I think we got to build up our stamina as individuals, as families, and as communities. I think that this thing is going to unfold. I like what you said about the Jubilee, like a cycle. This thing may take place in waves. Like, I think we need to, like, people are getting tired. You know, like, I'm tired of being in my house. I want to go out. I want to have fun. I want to blah, 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 blah. You know, I want to get back to normal. I want to do this. I want to do that. Like, I think there's a certain stamina that we're going to have to build, because I think, you know, things are open. Like, this is going to unfold. This is going to unfold over a period of time. I don't know how long that period of time is going to be. But I think that we need to build up our stamina to, you know, do the things that you're saying over time, you know, and even be prepared. Like, okay, like you was talking about stepping out, we might step out and have to step back in, you know?
And one of the things we haven't talked about yet, but that we'd love to bring in for the last few minutes of the conversation is just what is it going to mean as we're talking about resistance and risk-taking to also be in the midst of a time of mass mourning and death. So as you two know, but maybe some of the listeners don't, we planned our fall issue on G's months ago to be on death and dying, and decided to go through with it. So we're receiving pieces for that now. But we had no idea that we would be putting this issue out in the context of so much death and grief. So I just wonder how you two are thinking about communal mourning right now, or mourning in general, and how that might relate or not relate to resistance work, or how we can start doing that more in these ways that we have to stay isolated even when we want to be in community.
Glenn, Will and I have actually had some conversation about this a few weeks ago, just in a very kind of preliminary way, and there's so many dimensions to it. One, that there's, and it is a pastoral care issue. There's so much grief that's happening, and people are isolated in that, with often without support. I think of there being a distinction between grief and mourning. That grief is the suffering that's rooted in love and loss, and the emotional dimension of that. Mourning is the ritualizing, the processing, the ceremonializing, the communal embodying of grief in a way that not only pastors it, if you will, for the individual or the family who's lost, but also for the community. And what we were just beginning to have a beginning conversation about was also the way in which that mourning process could have a political dimension, at least what I would call political dimension, socially transforming power. And there are all kinds of examples. Latin America, the mothers of the disappeared who did their mourning in the public square in a way that called attention and exposed the paramilitary government, say, in any number of places, or the lynching memorial in Montgomery, where deaths that have been denied and covered over and forgotten are brought in a painful and excruciating way into the light, but also in a way that the energy of that mourning process can be transforming toward justice. Years ago, I was in a circle with Nelson Johnson from North Carolina, and we were having a similar conversation at that time. He had actually just been to the grave sites of his grandparents, and so the history of slavery and his connection to it in the South was sort of right there. And he said, you know, what if the history of suffering is a giant store which needs to be released? I'm paraphrasing him, I wish I could quote him precisely, but which needs to be released and could be in the service of social justice and transformation. What if that history processed with that energy could be put in the service of justice? And I think that's why we're in the midst of, how do we do that in this moment, separated? How do we pastor and care for and communally do funerals where you can't gather? I was part of one the other day by Zoom, but also thinking to the point where we can, hopefully we can be gathering in spaces, how we gather some of this history up and use what it exposes as a source of genuine personal and political transformation.
Very thought-provoking. Very thought-provoking. I was 16 when my mother passed, and I still finished high school on time, and was at that time, the lesson that I learned about death is that the train is not going to stop. You have to get back on it. I realize now, 20-something years later, that a lot of that attitude comes out of, one, capitalism and the machine, which keeps going, and the pieces can get ground up in the machine, but the machine will still go. But also slavery and the intergenerational trauma of slavery, in which you had to get up and you had to train your body, and literally the community had to form to support people to be able to get up. Whatever beatings you took, whatever happened, you had to train your body and train your community to get up the next day to work for the economy. And I think that to take the time for mourning and to say that we need a society that is not a machine. We need a society that does not ground you up if you're in mourning, and we need a different type of society. I think that we have an opportunity to do that. You know, Malidoma Some talks about in his culture with the Dagara people, their funeral days are 7 days, you know, and people come from all the villages, and they know that the family of the bereaved is not going to do anything for those 7 days, you know, and they have this whole complicated system of support, you know, whereas many times people have jobs and they get a day off. You know what I'm saying? But if it's your uncle and not your father or not your mother, you might not get any. You know, you have to like fill out a form and whatever. You know, if it's your cousin, they're like, no, you only get time off if it's your mother or your kid. You know what I'm saying? And that's one day. You know, and so I think that to vision that we can create a different type of society that has different types of supports. I mean, you see it now with all the people that are losing their jobs and stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like, we need a society that has supports. You know what I'm saying? And the mutual aid is a part of that. I think that encouraging, you know, in Detroit, there was a movement called New Work, New Culture, you know, which was like, how do we decrease our dependence on jobs and look to work in a different way? And so I think, yeah, we need a society that's going to allow for mourning and allow for grief, you know? And I appreciate all the questions and I appreciate all the conversation, you know, so we can wrestle our mind on what to do.
Thank you. We want to come to a pretty quick end here, but also just want to leave space for if either of you have questions for one another to sort of briefly end on.
I have a question for you, Bill.
Yeah.
I would love to hear a little bit. I've heard a little bit of the strategy of civil disobedience as relates to the civil rights movement, but I would love to hear, and I think it may be helpful to hear a little bit of your thoughts of in the 21st century, the strategy, whether it's the objectives or the objectives or the outcomes of the civil disobedience that is attractive to you and the civil disobedience that you've been evolving and leading for this many years.
Mm-hmm. Well, several things. One, in the civil rights movement, people put their bodies in spaces where it was forbidden and packed the jails. You know, Birmingham, they had no place to put people anymore. The high school students, you know, were coming out en masse, and they basically shut the place down. We haven't been, in my memory of activism in any position to do that kind of work, but I've continued to feel like putting a responsibility on the system to deal with your body in jail has been part of what direct action means. And I don't gainsay the huge distinction between black and white bodies in this process and my own. I did as part of the Poor People's Campaign, we did all these actions. Many people, over 100 people were involved in arrests, and those weren't entirely orchestrated, but often the court scene, you know, people came just prepared to pay several $100s and walk away, and there's still a value in that strategically, I think. On one occasion, partly because of the way the judge was treating people contemptuously, not even allowing them to make statements use the courtroom as a place to make statements and go on record. And he was sentencing people to 12 days or $300. And in that instance, I just had a gut reaction. I said, I'll do the time, give me the time. And a couple of us did do the jail time. And again, I would say the fact that we were in, even for that brief period of time, one, you get to taste what so many people do all the time, and as a matter of course, you get just a glimpse and a taste of that personally in terms of your own transformation. But also, I think it generated stuff on the outside. There weren't many people from that campaign who did any time in jail, and it was I think it represented and opened opportunities outside for raising the question of prisoners in general. And there were vigils, not for us as such, but for prisoners. It raised that whole dimension of the campaign as mass incarceration, and put it on the table, simply because we were pulling people into that space in a concrete, momentary way. So I continue to. I mean, I don't think there's any "this is the way to do it" way at all, but feel like it can have a strategic value and place in the movement of for direct action, rather than just paying your way out.
Thank you.
There's levels of privilege on both of those. I mean, I was in with lots of folks who were there because they couldn't pay bail. They didn't have the money to bond out, right? So, yeah. Anyway.
Well, I'm deeply, deeply grateful for both of you, and for all that you have taught to me and to all of the readers at G's, and for the work that we do. And I look forward to lots more conspiracies and holy mischief together. And for those who are listening, I think that this issue in general is just really powerful and offers a lot of really important questions for all of us to be thinking about right now. And you can find that on Jesus' website, and we'd love to send you the back copy. And also, with a month, we're sending out our summer issue, which is focused on trees. And it feels like really healing medicine for all of us in this particular moment. So we would love to have you join us as subscribers before that comes out this summer. So again, deep gratitude to all of you, and to Carl for hosting us here today too.
Thank you, friends. We want to say a word of encouragement. If you are interested in kind of living out some of the things you're reading in G's magazine, Motor City Wesley is pursuing a project called Motor City Villages. The idea is to get people connected with folks in their neighborhood, particularly neighborhoods of color, to be living out radical discipleship and world transforming action. So we've got a few issues of magazines every time to get to you if you're looking for that. And so just be in touch with us over at motorcitywesley.org. And as always, please check out gsmagazine.org for back issues, to subscribe yourself, to send in a $5 donation every month, whatever it is that you can do to support this important work. We really appreciate it. Thank you, friends.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.